Today on Uncommon Sense, join Joe and I as we interview retired Naval Commander John Sharp, publisher and co-founder of IHS Press, to talk to him about distributism, the Catholic land movement, and so much more. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your host. I'm joined as usual by my wonderful co-host, Joe. Joe, how are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Good. And we are lucky and blessed to be joined by John Sharp. Hi, John. How are you?
Hi, good morning, Grettelyn and Joe. I'm well. Thank you for having me. It's an honor. It's great to be with you this morning.
Wonderful. Well, we're excited to talk to you, particularly about the history of the Catholic land movement, which a lot of our listeners, being Chestertonians, will think of as distributism. But first, if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving our listeners and us a little background on yourself, a little history, let us know who you are.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Well, it's an honor. The role is one that I undertake kind of with reluctance. There are so many others who know more details and more deep history than myself. But I feel the role reluctantly. Quick background: was raised Catholic, kind of semi-serious, a little lukewarm. Like so many in the modern era. Around the early 1990s, I want to say, I came into, for lack of a better term, speaking very broadly, came into tradition. I learned about the old Latin Mass, certain older traditional doctrines of faith, things where I grew up in the 70s and early 80s. So, it just whatever it was, whatever the modern Catholic scene looked like at that time, that's all I knew. That's all I understood. It was through a professor. I went to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, so it was through a professor there who was a literature professor who did a lot of work with Shakespeare and the canon of the West, all the greatest Dickens, and certainly a lot of the Russian authors, Solzhenitsyn, et cetera. And through that kind of surreptitiously would very much like Chesterton, even in the era before his conversion, would throw out these aphorisms and observations based on the truths of literature, and eventually get people thinking, oh, well, does that mean there is a truth? And if there is, is a person represent that truth? Is there a truth incarnate? And if so, did he found a church? And then, the questions start coming and the answers fall into place. For anyone of goodwill, they're fairly obvious, but there's movements of grace and things that make, for some, those conversion paths different than others. For me, thanks be to God. I'm sure I was undeserving, but I feel like it was a very easy road. As soon as the light bulb started to come on, it started to burn very brightly. You just get enthused. And for me, being, I guess, by temperament, a bit of a bookworm, my outlet was reading. Just buying books hand over fist. I still do that today after 30 some years. You can see a bit of the library in the background. More books I have than I'll ever read, I'm ashamed to admit. I have stacks everywhere, nightstand, dining room table, everything's a mess all the time because there's all, books everywhere, half read, bookmarks sticking out. Long story short, in my 29 years in the Navy, I was assigned to Italy in the late 1990s, so the 96, 97, 98 timeframe. Met an Irishman over there. We both were assisting at the old Latin Mass in Italy, the only two English speakers. So when we went on a little social activity in our native language, get together for coffee or get together at his home. And he had a library like this that puts mine to shame. All first old editions of Belloc and Chesterton. So I thought, where does one get one's hands on these things? And he said, well, you can poke around. In those days, really, the secondhand book trade on the internet was not as robust as it is now. I mean, now I admit it's lazy. I just, before coming on with you, was typing into Bookfinder looking for Dorothy Day, Catholic Worker, Peter Morin, old pamphlets and things. And there's a bit of a lazy streak in all of us. I think it's so easy to just summon up either an old book or, a coffee machine from Amazon or what have you. We forget what it's like to have to literally sniff around in secondhand bookshops, looking for treasures on the shelf. But Anyway, most of them were apparently in his library. So after inquiring, how does one get a hold of, what remaining copies may be left? He said, well, that's our job and principally yours. You have to reprint all these things. He was 15 years older, probably mid 60s now. It's not regrettably not in great health. His name is Derek. So if we can all just keep him in our prayers, he's not really in good shape anymore. So he's kind of fallen out of the out of the picture as far as operating the press, which I cannot emphasize enough how little it is. A little mom and pop backwater of reprinting, few distributors tracks, little Belloc and Chesterton, few other things that we think are very important. But that for me was the confluence of the faith, the love of books, the interest in finding these old books. Where are they? Well, most of them are out of print, so let's get some of them in print. And then, ultimately, I guess for, everyone has different paths in their vocation. I contemplated the priesthood. I contemplated religious life. I think it is said that all serious Catholics, think about a vocation of that nature at some time or another. It's just sort of part of a make sure I do the right thing with my life, kind of checklist. I'm married with very happily married, thanks be to God. Again, blessings I'm sure I don't deserve, with 7 children, from the ages of 22, if I get it right, to 6. You probably saw the 6-year-old pop her head in here a minute ago. And so leaning more towards the family man, Catholic in the world, rather than religious life or priesthood. One then finally, I guess, if one is really open-minded and serious, gets to the question of how do we confront, how do we react to the obvious reality around us that the day-to-day society is anything but Catholic. It's anything but a society that makes it easy to practice virtue, follow the tenets of the faith, etc. And to me, that's the ultimate role of the layman, is to be this intersection between the church, the state, the family. And in order to do that well, one has to have all the material that's in all the old books that then one endeavors, to put back into circulation. And as Chestertonians, I'm conscious of, saying things that the two of you would say, yes, we heard that last week and the week before and the week before that, because he's really said it all. That's one of the wonderful things about him. But there are others. I would say in order to not be too compliant of a guest, I should try to throw out little bits of heresy, which is, Belloc's another great one, and Father McNabb is another great one. Which
we don't consider that heresy.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I used to try to get Dale to carry more of our Belloc books, and he said, "Have you read the title of our organization? What does that mean to you, American Chesterton?" Okay, I got it, Dale. But even GK would say, "Well, you can let Belloc in. He's all right. He's okay." But anyway, I'm sorry for the long background, but it just
No.
It explains why the few things that I'm passionate about, I guess that's true for all of us, how life moves you in certain directions, and you get these kind of fixations or commitments that are central to what you do with your time, what little bit of it's given to all of us.
Yeah, it's really kind of the movement of the Holy Spirit, I think, in our lives. It's beautiful.
Absolutely.
It's great. Yeah, it's great to see. I am curious though, like if we can back up just a little bit. When did you find Chesterton along this journey?
That's a very good question, Grettelyn. I the older I get, the poorer my memory is, and I was kind of sort of a funny thing. You introduced me as retired Navy. I also consider myself like retired, Catholic speaker, activist, etc. For a few months, maybe, stretch it to a couple of years. When we first started the IHS Press, I was more active, some blogs, some writing, etc. And then I'll be very honest with you. This is, maybe either a lot of folks would be very grateful for this, like thank God he stopped doing that, or it's a discredit to me. I kind of threw in the towel. I got distracted with things. I got in a bit. We don't have to get into this now, but it is an interesting story. I got into a bit of hot water with the Navy, so I spent years, dealing with that, and I would say it was time well spent, because I was advocating a Catholic response to the war in Iraq, which Uncle Sam didn't wasn't taking in my view. And so without, I don't want to get us off the track onto that, but that took a lot of time. And I kind of just, went to sit on the bench, and I just thought, boy, this is a pain in the neck. I don't really want to be involved anymore. I mean, I do deeply in my heart, but just the practicalities, got too painful. So I like to joke. One of my good friends who I think you had on is Mike, of Sharon, who did the Catholic Land Movement, the recent initiative, which is sort of why we're talking, I guess. I keep telling him, I'm retired, Mike. I'm not interested. I'm on the bench. I cede the place to you young men and women with energy and vision and all that. I'll help how I can, but I'm retired. Um, but the interesting thing about Chesterton is I have no memory of a defining moment. He was always in the background. Of course, he was on the shelf, in my friend's apartment, for lack of a better way to put it. In the library in the 90s. But he had been collecting Belloc and Chesterton probably since the 70s. And he knew our old friend Aidan Mackey. I don't know if the name rings any bells to you, but
Oh,
Aidan,
yeah.
and I'm assuming, I haven't heard from him in 18 months. Maybe I'm assuming he's still with us, because we would know if he had passed on, right? Um, and
Mm-hmm.
and Derek knew Aidan in the 70s.
Mm.
And so there's really, again, I feel blessed and not worthy to be in this chain of transmission. But there was really a passage of, I mean, I heard from Aidan firsthand the story of when he was, to go back to the heresy topic, when he was in Belloc's house as Belloc was upstairs, convalescing, and probably on, very close to death at that point. So Aidan then passes that to Derek. Derek passes it on to me. And that's why Chesterton's always this looming presence. I mean, he's just always been there. And anything you read that's worth its salt will always refer to Chesterton, quote Chesterton, etc. Very early on in that kind of the new convert experience that we all have, where your enthusiasm is fresh, and so it's all very exciting. And then the sort of wet noodles like myself say, forget it, I'm retired. And then you come out of it, you come back to the books, you say, well, it's still very interesting. You're still passionate about it, but it's seasoned. It's less of that useful enthusiasm. Uh, so I plow through Orthodoxy, What's Wrong with the World. Derek recommends The Outline of Sanity, which was our first book that we reprinted. Very, very narrowly distributous. I mean, you can't say narrow about anything with Chesterton, but both physically and ideologically, historically. But it is a very expressly distributist writing. There's no question about
Yeah.
that. But I think What's Wrong with the World probably moved me the most. And then as you learn more about him, and you realize this kind of genius is coming from decades before his conversion to the faith. And even Orthodoxy, it's a book you could recommend unreservedly. Hopefully I can say even more than C.S. Lewis, who I acknowledge is, instrumental in a lot of, including my father's conversion. But I think Chesterton's, in a class by himself compared to Lewis. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that you're recommending the writings of a man who has not yet come into the church, who expresses the claims of the Catholic faith better than numerous cradle Catholics, converts well before him, etc. It's extraordinary. But it's got to be Grettelyn. You'll notice that I talk a lot, never answer the question. So I don't know, other than I can say it goes back to the early '90s. But he's just always been there. Ever any memory I have of being interested in Catholic writings, Catholic literature, this issue of the Catholic Church's approach to society, politics, family issues, all the social problems. Chesterton's just always there. He's always been there for me.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how, going back to that idea of Chesterton, some of these writings, these great writings that we think of as quintessential, coming prior to his conversion. And in a certain way, I think Chesterton's career mirrors the development of what we think of as Catholic social teaching. I mean, obviously, there's always been a sort of Catholic social attentiveness. It's goes back to prior even to Saint Augustine. I mean, some of the early church fathers are commenting on these sorts of issues. It's there present in Aquinas, definitely, but there is sort of this new engagement with the notion that arises in the 19th century, culminating, of course, in Rerum Novarum. But in a similar way, Chesterton and the development of what we think of now as properly the Catholic social magisterium, beginning with Rerum Novarum, they address themselves simultaneously to sort of the Catholic mindset, to the Catholic ethos, but also just to men and women of goodwill, right? That
100%.
it's that kind of both and of faith and reason. And that this is what I think is, this is sort of the silver bullet, as it were, or the hidden stockpile. Somebody calls it the church's best kept secret, right?
Yes.
This is what we can go out to the world with. And I think in my own life, it was instrumental in me beginning to take my own Catholicism more seriously, because a high school teacher assigned us Rerum Novarum, and I read it, and I thought, this is not what I thought of as the church addressing itself to the world, because all I had ever heard from the church was, I hate to say it, but these kind of bromides, the homilies that were banal and just about sort of like be nice to one another, and
Yes.
it seemed very detached to me. But then the real concern, the real insight, the real familiarity with day-to-day problems of human beings that Leo the 13th manifest there was just such an eye-opener to me, and it really reinvigorated my faith at a crucial time in my life. So it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And your comment, I think, brings to the fore a number of sort of interesting. I mean, this is again near and dear to the heart of all Chestertonians. I was going to say tension, but really it's a paradox. So many could be brought up, but your very interesting one about the opening of the church to the non-Catholics through Catholic social teaching. We know, for example, of E.F. Schumacher, in his book "Small is Beautiful," which everyone's familiar with, or should be anyway. He expressly says at some point, either there or in autobiographical writings, that what ultimately brought him into the faith was Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, etc. And Douglas Hyde, who's another famous one, Englishman, former communist, 1930s, one of the leading lights in the communist circles in England in the 1930s on the Daily Worker. Maybe a senior editor. I lose track of the biographical details. But he was a militant communist, not because he was evil, but because he was looking for justice, and that's the only public thing he knew of to chase after. And somehow, the same thing happens to him. Someone hands him an encyclical or a pamphlet, and he tells the story. I think the book is called "I Believed," past tense, believed. And he tells the story of his conversion from communism to Catholicism. And he goes through this period of struggle where, he's writing on the surface of the desk. He's doing his editorials for the communist paper. And underneath, he's reading Quadragesimo Anno and Rerum Novarum and figuring out, like, now, most of you would actually be very intrigued by this, but if I am too overt, it's like me and Uncle Sam over the war in Iraq. It's not going to go well, for my communist publishing career. So there's so many that come in this way, but it's very interesting because the paradox, we're familiar with the phrase, which I believe goes back to Tertullian, but you two may correct me. The Latin phrase is anima naturaliter Christiana, the soul naturally Christian. And one says, well, that's a little bit of a contradiction in terms, because we're talking nature, and nature is human nature, soul joined to body, soul is intellect and will, all the old Aristotelian psychology, etc. That's nature. And then the Christian part of it is grace, the supernatural order, the rivers of mercy and grace that are opened by Calvary. You certainly know the story. But there's this notion that if God creates man to return to him, then every man is destined for heaven. Every man is a Catholic in waiting. And so there's this very interesting dynamic, and it's been debated through centuries as to how much can we ultimately do without the church. And clearly all these encyclicals that are so important eventually end up, usually at the end, with a reminder, okay, we've laid out sort of the philosophical and even some broadly technical advice and a vision as to how to move society back in the right direction. But ultimately, these problems won't be solved without religion. And therein lies the paradox, of opening the door to the non-Catholics. But then when they get to the door, you say, okay, well, to come in, make the next step, and the final step that so many of our heroes, made at one point or another. But very interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a great transition too, to talk more about the Catholic land movement itself. It certainly was a key element, at least in the English side of it, I think, at the beginning. Would you like to speak to that at all? Father Vincent McNabb, one of our heroes.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's I remember hearing somewhere that's what we're supposed to be talking about. So it's good to get into that. But on a strictly practical level, and I don't know how much Mike talks about this. For all the what I think are unfortunate, arguably false accusations, or the bromides, to use your word, Joe, against distributism, that these people are kind of want to turn back the clock. They have their head in the sand against progress, Luddites. The whole you've heard it all before. Practically speaking, one of the, if not the most significant down to earth motivation or impetus for the land associations. And just as a quick background, when we talk Catholic land movement, the term movement itself we could unpack. Is it an enthusiastic idea, that's taking off? It is an organized thing with membership cards. Is it some combination of all those things? Well, yes and no, depending upon your perspective. In England, just to start with a sort of a milestone, late 1920s, there was an orchestrated effort, started in Scotland, in fact, with the clergy, but then also the lay people, lay volunteers and sort of the enthusiasts, if you will, getting involved to solve one particular problem, which is following World War I. We have the soldiers who were fortunate enough to make it home constitute this large labor force with not enough jobs to go around, frankly. And the question was asked, well, and again, it's against the background of, and I would argue, again, maybe heretical, but just to create some excitement, I would argue that the position of the church, through Leo the 13th and certainly into Pius the 11th and 12th, was not super favorable towards what we know as capitalism today. We could do a whole separate series of programs on that, but I'll throw out the assertion. I think it can be defended. And I would argue there really is no other truth in the matter, that the church was not sanguine about the shift of a social order where you have people making their living on small scale levels. In other words, we know that the fruit of capitalism in general, which is what even Marx observed, he does get certain things right when he analyzes the history. It's the solutions and the philosophy and the lack of religion that's all wrong. But there are certain things that he says that are correct. And I think this is standard in the history, is that industrialism, capitalism, which is numerous forces working together, separated labor and capital so that you have a large pool of individuals who have nothing but labor power, which they exchange. They take their time and their labor power exchange for money. They then, provide for their necessities. And then you have owners of capital. And Joe, this is a perfect reference to Rerum Novarum, because Leo the 13th starts out by saying that there's this massive conflict between these two segments of the population, the owners of capital and the others who don't own capital, but they possess only their labor power. The church, I think, in general, has always advocated, without proposing a particular scheme, trying to reunite labor and capital, not just in cooperative groups and not just in, goes to your banal sermons, Joe, not just in little, coffee hours after Mass where the stingy capitalist and the poor downtrodden worker, for an hour they call a truce, and they have a coffee together and meditate. Oh, wasn't that a nice sermon? Yes, we can agree because it didn't say anything. So we're totally agreed that the sermon was fine. But beyond just the platitudinous kind of, oh, everyone get along and work together, we're all Christians, et cetera, which I don't knock any of that, but it doesn't necessarily move the cause forward, practically. The church's view was always, if we can cover and reestablish, almost like little islands and oases, modes of living where the labor and capital is reconnected, so that a person who owns his labor also owns a bit of capital upon which he can apply his labor and then generate some bits of sustenance. No, we're not talking Robinson Crusoe where it's a guy with a knife and a loincloth and he's out in the jungle and it's like you do it all for yourself. That's not the ultimate distributus. The ultimate distributus is someone who has as this vision the value of reuniting labor and capital. And again, I think one has to admit that that's much easier to do in smaller scale modes of production and smaller scale modes of living. So when the initial effort or the initial visionaries of this idea of the land movement, they didn't call it the land movement at the time. It was just a thing that was a natural response to what's the problem. The problem is the north of England is flooded with an unemployed workforce, namely soldiers and sailors coming home, and we need to do something for them. And there are simply not enough wage earning jobs, or as Chesterton, Belloc, others would say, there's not enough wage slavery that's available to them. So what do we do with these men? Well, why not teach them at least to manage a small plot of land where they can grow things to eat and they can work together and provide some of their basic necessities. As you mentioned, Joe, again, take all the leads that you've thrown out for me, going all the way back to the fathers, way before Augustine and before our Lord. There's always the three basic necessities: food, clothing, and shelter, right? That's really what we need. Everything else is arguably superfluous or certainly less necessary. So that was the vision. Try to get this unemployed workforce trained in a way where they can start to meet some of these basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, by working for themselves on their own. And I believe it's fair to say that the emphasis was really 100% practical. Everything I talked about with sort of the growing capitalist industrialist drift of society from easily 1600, but certainly 1750 and then into 1900s, that's in the background. But I don't believe they start this as this kind of militant, we're going to raise the banner, up the standard or up the mast, if you will, and say, this is the vision for the church. This is the vision for Catholicism. That came later. It was initially a very practical, down to earth, desire to solve this problem. Pause, if you want, or just interrupt, with questions or comments. But absent that, I'll keep going and say that by the early 1930s, it's picking up. There's different. The original thing was eventually called the Catholic Land Associations of England and Wales. So it was little associations, again, north of England, Scotland, which as we know is way up north, and then Birmingham, south of England, Midlands, et cetera, just different associations that different, again, enthusiasts and volunteers with some, and even the role with the clergy was mixed. Some of the clerics were very favorable, in certain areas. In other areas, they were more sanguine, very similar to our Northeast in the United States in the late 1800s, where a lot of the clergy were not super interested in a large migration of Catholics out to the West. They were very happy to have a critical mass of Catholics, a large population of Catholics, to kind of keep that Catholic power juxtaposed to the rising, WASP and Protestant power. So the reaction of the clergy was mixed. This is, of course, where Father McNabb comes in. Father Vincent McNabb, English Dominican, a black friar, as they call the Dominicans because of their outer black garment. He certainly ranks up there with, again, I'll try to shy away from anything too heretical, but he ranks up there with Chesterton and even Belloc as one of the most visionary, unique characters in England at the time, who was brilliant, but who also lived that life. Very similar for those of you who are favorable towards Dorothy Day and Peter Marin, and I know she sometimes generates adverse reactions depending upon what the subject is. But McNabb was someone who walked all around London, wore out the pair of boots until they were almost thinned and falling to pieces. Just a figure in Hyde Park, constant preaching, the making of converts, spiritual conferences, writing on Catholic social teaching. And he would say, and I think this is correct, he would say, people ask me if I'm a distributist. I'm not an anythingist. I'm a Catholic, but
Mm.
I look at, and then this is kind of the other perspective. Again, just to recap, we started with the land movement as literally narrow efforts designed to solve a very particular problem, with that kind of ideological and historical sense that there's something wrong about things when they get so big that humanity is cut into two warring camps. So that
Mm.
was there, but it was in the background. And then McNabb comes along and he says, I'm not so much interested in the historical context or solving the particular problem of the unemployed working man. McNabb looks at it as uh, what is the ultimate point of being a Catholic? Well, the point of being a Catholic is to save one's soul. So, what are the conditions we need to create or need to encourage to make that easy? And so, he
Mm.
was looking at a number of angles. For example, the standard statistical observation in the big cities that Catholics tend to have fewer children or almost none
Mm.
because of the pressure, because of how difficult it is to raise a family. And in those days, one of the great things, I'm sure you find this with Chesterton, is there are certain what me in my old fashioned point of view, what I would call truths of the faith that are not debatable. The whole question of contraception and all that. That's not something I think much about anymore, because to me it's just a given. I accept what I
Mm.
think is the traditional Catholic position. So when you read Chesterton, McNabb, and others, when they're writing in the 20s and 30s, we have the luxury of a period when there isn't this crazy controversy, with the leftward the direction of the clergy and things like that. But McNabb was looking at it very simply. What kind of condition do we need to create for a family, following the model of Nazareth, to have its food, clothing, and shelter in a way that keeps this kind of spiritual, moral, psychological space, this oasis, if you will, of sanity, to use GK's word. And for him, the life on the land was the obvious answer to that.
Mm.
Again, not so much because there's some kind of, I think when we are assaulted, or at least as I used to be before I retired, and ridiculed about this kind of utopian vision,
Mm.
I've come to find over many years that you can't you can't really find in the historical evidence, the journal articles, the books, etc., anyone really advocating this utopian vision that we are accused of advocating. It's always extremely practical. Someone reacting to a very specific problem, whether it be the unemployment issue that we talked about following World War One, or McNabb saying, to be very blunt about it, where do we put families so that they're not coerced into contracepting? How do we
Mm.
do that? And what kind of, so today, to me, which is why I insist on being retired, because I feel like I don't need to do anything. Whatever little contribution I made for 10 minutes 20 years ago, I'm not needed anymore, because all
Mm.
you need to do is hit YouTube and put, homesteading, and the results blow your mind. And every one of them is some picture of a nice mother and father with little kids carrying the egg baskets around, fetching the eggs out of the coops, taking care of the animals, feeding the sheep, feeding the cows in the morning. And
Mm-hmm.
it's beyond anything really that anyone may have imagined. If one goes back to this period of, say, early 2000, when I believe there was a lot of controversy over distributism. There still is a little bit, but I'm kind of, honestly, this, not that you care about my sentiments, but I'm so over that now, because if you just look at what's going on, the naysayers have kind of lost the momentum. Like no one is prepared at this point to say, if a family says, well, we're going to go get some land because we want some chickens, something. I don't know if GK ever said this, but he certainly would have said, it's nice to know where an egg comes from. It's not out of a carton,
Mm.
it's out of a chicken. I think he
Yeah.
says that more about milk, that the milk comes from a cow, not a container. But it's just so normal now that
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like not worth arguing about. But
Yeah, and it's almost gained like it was gained like natural traction in the world. A lot of people who aren't Catholic, who have no idea of any of this sort of theory of it, have just decided that they would rather be homesteaders than
100%, and it goes back exactly to what Joe said. I don't know if it was. I'm guessing it was just the elegant workings of the Holy Ghost, Joe. That your original comment, hit like 6 key points that we keep coming back to. but clearly one of those is the natural draw. And it's also very interesting because I confess to not being plugged in enough, being retired, to know everyone's take on all of the different controversial issues. But I think it's fair to say, just as a historical report, that a lot of folks were driven to the "I want chickens out of an egg" by COVID and by all the lockdowns and all the rest. And people are thinking, man, I look in the store, the shelves are empty, or the single carton of factory eggs is up to $7 a dozen. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to just get on the internet and say, I want a box of chicks. They drop them off at the post office, put them in the backyard, make a coop, let them grow for 5 months, maybe. They start laying. You go get eggs and say, like, well, the egg comes from a chicken. This is remarkable. It's almost like there's a supreme being that worked all this out, to provide for our needs. And that's, again, just like the World War I unemployment problem. The Father McNabb with the problem of contraception, or the Malthusians is the one he used to use that word. This whole notion that population will grow to the point where the lack of the ability of the economy and the industrial framework to support people will just start dying off because there's just not enough resources. And his view is that the pressure to contracept is a clear, tangible signal of that principle working when the economy is out of scale. That would be McNabb's point. But that's practical, and the response to COVID is practical. And then Grettelyn, as you say, just the kind of the instinct, and I guess this is where you can get a little romantic and a little utopian. Pius XII, Pius VII, churchmen, bishops throughout modern history have, I think, properly talked about the historical connection of humanity with the land. I mean, that's a thing. We can't, no matter how much we want to deny it or say it's passé, it's definitely a thing. And I can speak for myself. Maybe the two of you would feel, there's some resonance with you. But as a former Navy man being moved around from place to place, I never got attached to anywhere. I never had any roots, really. Someone says, well, where are you from? It says, well, what period of my life are you talking about? My dad's Boston. My wife is Detroit. Mom is Chicago. I'm Los Angeles. Then I did, Southeastern Virginia, then Northern Virginia, DC, Pentagon, just colossal hellhole of everything that involves the federal government, and moving around everywhere. And I have no, I'm the opposite of the Englishman who can look at a hill on the Cotswolds and say, I lose track of the generations. I point back, and then it goes into the mists of history. Like, I don't know my great 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 grandfather because there's no records, but this is our place, and we moderns, I think, or many of us anyway, don't have that that psychological, moral, spiritual rootedness of being attached to a place. And that's very important, I think, in the human psyche, and part of why things just get nuttier and nuttier is because everyone's just moving so much. So
I think one of the common threads that connects so much of this is this idea of peace and security, right? It's not complicated, and yet I think a lot of people miss this in what the church is after, with the social teaching of the church, but also so much else. Just general moral teaching of the church and general pastoral praxis is that the what Christ offers is freedom to be free. He offers peace, security. He says, don't look at the birds of the field. The birds, they don't worry. The lilies of the field, the birds of the sky. And yet, it's very telling to me that in the modern kind of and I'm not criticizing it, in the modern people that are calling Catholics forth and trying to invigorate their holiness and their lives of virtue, you get much more, ironically, militant language often than we did in ages past. You also get much more of kind of this. It sounds like a great thing. Become a saint. That's your goal in life. Well, yes, that is your goal in life. But if you interpret that as being live a life of heroic virtue, well, you may be setting yourself up for you may be setting yourself up for danger there, in that heroic virtue is there's a reason that the canonized saints are few compared to all those others that get to heaven. And this was McNabb's, I think, brilliant, empowering message to the average lay person, to the average Catholic, was that change the game, change the circumstances, put yourself in a situation where an ordinary man living an ordinarily virtuous life, not heroically virtuous, but ordinarily virtuous, can get his way to heaven. Remove yourself from the near occasions of sin. Just do these wise things. And it's very much a parallel kind of in politics to the little way of Saint Therese of Lisieux. Don't engage in these martyrdoms. So yes, there is holiness and virtue to be found in living in Babylon, as Father McNabb calls it, in the
with
heart,
the flesh pots, right?
yeah, in a heart of a modern industrial city, and having a large family there, and figuring out how to, say, make it work in an apartment complex, and paying all of the taxes and rent, and having 2 vehicles and everything else. Sure, that's possible, but it's not easy. And at every step along the way, you're going to have much more dire pitfalls than the simplicity of life that makes virtue and holiness so much more accessible to the ordinary person that isn't chosen and predestined by God to be a great saint raised to the altars, right? So I think that this is something increasingly that is approachable for the ordinary Catholic in the pews, and I do expect to see kind of a resurgence of this kind of thinking, because I think people have realized that we're trying to fight the battle out in the world and just take that battle on the world's terms is a losing proposition. The world, the flesh, and the devil are not. This is another point. You flee temptation. You don't just step up to it and present yourself to it again and again and combat it. That's not spiritually wise. That's a foolish action. So
Right. And we know from our Lord's words when he was queried, Lord, teach us to pray, and we hear in the Our Father that this temptation is not something where in Thomas's great commentary on the Our Father, he says, well, temptation is permitted, because ultimately virtue must be tested, but that's on God's terms. And we're constantly taught, both in the Our Father and then in the great, scene from Lent where our Lord is tempted, and Satan says, well, throw yourself off, the angels will come get you. He says, do not tempt God. And there's very much of a tempt God there. And then, Joe, like I've said all the way through your comments, unfortunately, every time you speak, there's 3 or 4 ideas where you say, okay, you need an hour lecture on that, and an hour one on that, and an hour one on that. You could do an entire course or an entire series, but
that's typical, Joe.
But very interesting, because again, I guess it's the Chesterton show, so it should be just all paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes is, I think, what you've exactly said, that when Catholics in general say we can let society become, ultimately as difficult as possible for preserving the faith and practicing virtue, we can handle it. That's where your little way idea comes in. Namely, I shouldn't be setting myself up as heroic conquest. It should be the day-to-day living. And then on the other hand, you realize, and this is, I think, probably the clearest expression, at least from sort of traditional Catholic social teaching, before you get much later into your banal sermons and worried more about saving whales that beach themselves than aborted children, and all that kind of lefty mindset that has taken over. The clearest traditional expression of the term was under Pius XI, when he referred to social justice as a particular thing, that it involves the structure of society. And Dorothy Day, and they all talked about this, but she was another one who used to hammer on this point, that if society is sort of out of whack with the needs of man, with the needs of the soul, with the trajectory of salvation, that's ultimately why we're here. It's a pilgrimage to get to heaven. If you don't believe that, then the whole thing is a waste of time, right? And it makes GKC meaningless, because you could say every word he wrote ultimately was serving that end, was to to attach himself to God and take as many people with him as he possibly could. And if that's actually our path, then the whole machinery surrounding that, all of our systems of exchange and meeting material needs, and the media and the rest of it, all has to serve that end. And then that's the paradoxical element to me, because clearly, like Mike, who in modern day, over the last several years has come to be the front man for the idea of the Catholic land movement. It does take some heroes to come out of retirement, which is why I'm staying in there. I'll leave that to him, but to actually do something, because this idea of changing structures, even small structures, even if it's a question of 1 or 2 or 3 families that live nearby, and we know that's going on all over the country. I will confess personally, my experiences, I'm more in touch with some of the more, let's say, hardline, traditionalist groups. I don't want to get too political, and off the subject on that. I tend to be very ecumenical in that respect. So anyone who wants to practice and love the old Catholic faith, I'm totally, open to that. But I'm certainly aware that in that milieu, there are a lot of places people are going to have, families together, schools, parishes, etc. And I know that in some of the regular TLM communities that have survived, that's going, and I know that it's going on in the Novus Ordo as well. That it's not there's no monopoly on that in any particular approach to the faith today. I think the essentials of the faith drive people there, and Grettelyn, in one of the long-winded papers I sent you, I skimmed it this morning too, just to refresh my memory. The great GK with McNabb, and I think it was Herbert Shove, who I'm glad you introduced me as retired commander, because he was also retired. He outranked me eventually. He was a Navy captain before he was all done, ex-submarine driver like myself, who was one of the leaders in the south of England of the land movement and distributism. But the three of them come together in the, I want to say either 29, 31, something like that, with this little pamphlet for the Catholic Truth Society, just explaining what is the Catholic land movement. And the motto was "Plant the faith by planting the faithful."
I love that. Yeah.
And that's really it in a nutshell, is we're all striving for ways to make practicing the faith, again, taking your lead on this, Joe, to make it more natural and frankly less difficult, because it's hard enough to be a saint just in a sane society, let alone one that's become completely unglued, like ours. So
Amen.
yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I wish we could keep going for like another hour.
No, that's fine. And maybe, and
we do have to wrap up.
I would love to do some more, and maybe we'll pick Joe's brain. He can lay out an outline and say, okay, please follow program, please discuss. Cause I think,
well, you see, he's got Dorothy Day over his shoulder there. So
yeah,
I don't know, maybe at some point we'll have to have a Dorothy Day version of this conversation.
100%. Yeah. There's so much, Grettelyn. There's one of the things that I know we didn't, get into too much, which would be nice in some other occasion, either here or elsewhere, whatever, is there are so many of these heroes. You mentioned, Joe, the little way, and our little way, certainly speak for myself, my very little way would not exist at all were it not for these heroes who did come out of their shell and articulate the vision and put the vision into practice. And you could do just a whole series, multi-dozens of, they're not canonized saints, so we don't know of them as Catholics in that respect, but all of the compatriots of McNabb. I was just reading a book of essays by Walter Scheuring, which was a companion of Eric Gill, who was the stonecutter, when the whole experiment of the ditchling arts and crafts and all that. That's something obviously we didn't get into, but there's just so many of these figures like Dorothy Day who are so instructive. And the thing that's nice is their testimony, I find, is not cumulative. In other words, each one of them, they're saying, they're reinforcing ideas, that are important to us and that are central to the vision, certainly of GK and so many others. But each one has, through human personality, their own angle on it. And so you never read it and say, "Oh, I heard that before, last week." There's always a certain twist or a certain angle or a certain insight that makes it fruitful to look at what these individuals stood for, what they did, and how they articulated the vision. That just adds to the depth and the understanding and the excitement of all of it, frankly.
And really shows forth that it could be for anybody. I mean, I think a lot of people look at distributism and the Catholic land movement and they think to themselves, "Oh my gosh, I can't go be a farmer."
Yeah.
And maybe you could, maybe you can't, but the idea is that there are ways and means to do distributism, social justice, really,
Yes.
that are available to everybody, and you can sort of find, like you said, almost like your patron saints, canonized or not.
100%. And so it's just it's like a limitless, inexhaustible resource, like the householder who continues to bring out of the barn old things and new, and it's just could go forever. So really,
Beautiful.
really grateful for the time, and I think it was very interesting. And Joe, thank you for your inspirational remarks.
No, thank you. It's been
very nice. Yeah,
great chat.
Very nice. And I guess it's a good sign when it goes fast, right? When you feel it's already an hour gone. So that's
oh
great.
My gosh, yeah. But thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great.
Okay, my pleasure.
And thank you so much, Joe. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. And just remind you to please subscribe, hit the like button, make sure that you get word of us every time that we release something new. Leave us a comment if you have anything you want to say back to us, back to John. You can email us at podcast@chesterton.org and let us know what you thought. We'd love to hear from you. And again, always remember that Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you and God bless.